Okay, so throughout this chapter, we're going to be looking at the decade of the 1970s, which includes the Nixon era, where we last left off. We talked about Nixon's election. What was kind of I don't guess the slogan is really the best word, but what was sort of the theme, the kind of platform overall for Nixon in that election of 1968? What was he trying to appeal to? Yeah, law and order, right? So we had all this seeming chaos and turmoil of the 1960s, and we'll talk more about it later when we look at Nixon's domestic policy, but his appeal to a rise of more conservative voters that were not on board or that were very nervous about the seeming, violence and the seeming, seemed like things were coming apart. And he builds a strong base and a lot of support with those more conservative Americans. So we're going to start by looking at Nixon's foreign policy. And this is where Nixon actually makes probably some of his greatest achievements. Some of the things, Nixon is a president probably more than any other. I think you could easily make the case more than any other. His presidency really overall gets known for sort of one thing. And what is that? Corruption. If you didn't know or don't recall, Nixon is the only president to resign the presidency due to scandal. And that without that resignation would have, suffered impeachment, quite possibly removed from office. And so it is those, misdeeds, that corruption and all of that marks his legacy. But there were a lot of things that Nixon was able to accomplish, particularly, like I said, in the way of foreign policy. Nixon is a very crafty individual. He has been in politics as a good long while. We first talked about him when he first ran for president against John F. Kennedy in 1960. He has built his career earlier on as a strong anti-communist. He was part of that House of Un-American Activities Committee investigating government employees and such. So he is very smart, he is very shrewd, he is very capable. But he is also very paranoid. He is very much has a strong inferiority complex, takes things personally. He does not trust. He's incredibly introverted, does not make friends really well. Lacks a lot of qualities that sometimes you might argue politicians really kind of need, being able to sort of rub shoulders with people and, establish relationships and have kind of this warmth to them. And he just does not have that. That's not comfortable to him. And that paranoia and that inferiority complex and taking things very personally and being incredibly suspicious, those are some of the things that will lead to his downfall. But we'll see a lot of that stuff more when we get to the domestic side of things. We're going to first start by talking about Nixon and the Vietnam War, which of course was still going on and is the conflict that Nixon inherits, from Johnson. After, 1968 or so, the United States was not really trying to so-called win the war in Vietnam anymore, and was, not escalating things anymore, but the fighting was, of course, continuing in a stalemate. And the question and the goal became, how do we get out while saving face? How do we get out without just packing up completely and allowing South Vietnam to fall? So that's one of the things that Nixon wants to address, and one of those first goals was to calm the storm over Vietnam. In fact, when Nixon runs for president in 1968, as well as the whole law and order sort of strategy, he also campaigns on this idea that he has a, quote, secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. Now, as you probably, hopefully know, what does it probably mean when a politician or a leader tells you they got a secret plan for something? They probably don't have one. So whether or not he really had, probably not. But anyway, that so-called secret plans turns out to be something, whether he had this plan from the beginning, again, probably not. But Nixon's policy turns out to be something that he calls Vietnamization. Vietnamization means that they're going to start withdrawing American troops, start fighting less of the fight with American soldiers, and turning all that over to the South Vietnamese. So kind of going back to that original goal of we're going to train South Vietnamese forces to fight and train them to, deal with this themselves. Their military forces, their police forces, so that they can stop the Viet Cong, and they can stop North Vietnamese aggression and so forth. So it's a policy of starting to gradually pull U.S. forces out and returning the war over to the South Vietnamese, thus the name Vietnamization. We're going to turn it over to the South Vietnamese, and then we gradually start the process of removing. And also at the same time that we are withdrawing our forces, they will also start peace negotiations. So they're starting to work on that as well, peace negotiations with the North Vietnamese, but it takes a while to get any kind of an agreement there, and there's lots of politics involved in that we're not going to get into, because, like I said, Nixon doesn't want to just give up, they don't want to just withdraw. They also want there to be some kind of an agreement, to respect South Vietnam's boundaries and so forth and so on. So we're going to start to see that process of Vietnamization. American forces are going to start to be gradually pulled out. But in the meantime, the fighting does continue. Now, oddly enough, even though Nixon is withdrawing American forces and negotiating for peace, so in a way, de-escalating things, on the other hand, kind of the opposite is happening, because another thing that Nixon does for political reasons is to try to, get more leverage at the negotiating table. The war is actually also expanded into Cambodia. So there begins under the Nixon administration a secret bombing campaign into Cambodia. Remember that that Ho Chi Minh Trail, that was the supply line, that was how the South Vietnamese the Viet Cong were getting a lot of their supplies, almost all of their supplies from North Vietnam. It was through that Ho Chi Minh Trail. And that Ho Chi Minh Trail went through where? Cambodia. It went through Cambodia and Laos. And so the idea was to start bombing in Cambodia to take out, those supplies and to diminish the ability of the Viet Cong to be supplied. And they're also, hoping that this is going to put more pressure, as well as, diminishing the supplies and, diminishing the Viet Cong's ability to fight, but also hoping that would put more pressure on North Vietnamese government to negotiate and to give in to some of the United States' terms. So there begins this about 14-month-long secret bombing campaign, and I may say that it was secret because this was not known to the American public for quite a while. This was not something that would have been put in the newspapers. It was a top secret kind of action. Guess not. And they drop huge amounts of bombs, do tons of damage. It does not completely disrupt the ability to, supply the Viet Cong. They never do seem to get a handle on that. It does put a little bit of pressure on the North Vietnamese at the negotiating table, but it does massive amount of damage. And actually, it leads to some very chaotic consequences in Cambodia. Cambodia will, without going too much into that whole story, will soon erupt into civil war, into mass chaos because of that bombing campaign, as well as it causing a lot of damage, a lot of death, a lot of destruction. And you can imagine that when it does go public, when it does become known to the American public that this was going on, people are going to be quite outraged about it, because we know that people were already becoming very outraged over the war in Vietnam itself, and outraged over and feeling, deceived by the United States government for a number of reasons. A few things we'll talk about in a moment. So the Cambodia campaign won't do much to instill trust or faith in the government. Okay, so so when this does go public, as well as there was just already, we know, a lot of protests over Vietnam that was already going on. But when the secret bombing campaign of Cambodia does go public, that of course ignites mass protests. There had already been, we talked about lots of protest movements, particularly amongst college campuses. And that is going to lead to a particularly violent incident at one of those college protests. Some of you may have heard of the Kent State incident. This is in Ohio. Kent State was a university in Ohio, is a university in Ohio, I should say. And in 1970, there were student demonstrations taking place. They were protesting the bombing of Cambodia. And again, these demonstrations erupted all over the place. There were hundreds of colleges that dealt with demonstrations, some of them peaceful and there were no issues, but several where they were at least disruptive enough where hundreds of universities had to at least, cancel classes or shut down for a time because the whole place had been so disruptive, or students had taken over parts of buildings and things like that. But the most significant of those campaigns and the most violent of those demonstrations happened at Kent State, where students were protesting, and then it gets really crazy when the students actually burned down the ROTC building, and the ROTC being a symbol of, the military and this whole military industrial complex and this aggressiveness and everything that was happening in Cambodia. And so the National Guard was sent out to stop the violence and stop the rioting, because again, it was erupting into rioting and violence in some college campuses like this one. And when the students are trying to confront the National Guard, and then somewhere in the confusion, the National Guardsmen, which were somewhat poorly trained, panicked and fired into the crowds and killed 4 students. So 4 college students, 4 protesters killed in what is sometimes called the Kent State Massacre. And while it was determined that the National Guardsmen here were were unjustified in that action, there wasn't like significant punishment or anything. But again, this kind of just represented how ugly some of these anti-war protests and how much of an uprising and how much anger was created by the continuing war in Vietnam. So even though the United States is beginning to withdraw forces, this was still quite a source of contention and quite a source even of violence. So the United States continues to start to withdraw forces while at the same time is trying to negotiate a peace. And we finally, we'll get to that in a second. All right, so mistrust of the government and mistrust of the authorities, has already been shattered just by Vietnam itself, certainly by the secret bombing of Cambodia. When you have things like Kent State happening, again, that is also fueling more mistrust and more feelings that, the government is, out to get people and all sorts of things. But another event, instance that also contributes to this distrust of government and anger over the war in Vietnam, as well as a lot of other kind of phenomena this is demonstrating, was the publication of the Pentagon Papers, and I believe this is 71. The Pentagon Papers, this was a secret, it was a study actually, it was the results of a study that the Defense Department had launched into the Vietnam War back in the 60s, I can't remember what year. But the then Secretary of Defense had commissioned this study of let's look into what got us into the war. The result of that was these top secret Pentagon Papers is what they're called. And the Pentagon Papers end up getting stolen and leaked to the press by a former, I believe he worked for the Defense Department, former employee of the Defense Department. He gets a hold of these and he leaks them to the press. And the thing about these Pentagon Papers is that they reveal a great deal of deception that had taken place to get the United States into the war in Vietnam. What do we mean by deception? Yeah. Information that was not entirely accurate. Okay, remember that whole Gulf of Tonkin thing we talked about? We said that it was an unprovoked attack. The Pentagon Papers revealed that it was not exactly unprovoked. That the United States was there. The ships were there to supervise, and encourage an attack by South Vietnam on North Vietnam. So it was not entirely unprovoked. That the United States did have a role in that had not been, that Congress didn't know about, that Johnson chose not to mention. And remember, that was the event that led to the United States escalating their presence in Vietnam. The Pentagon Papers revealed that the American public and Congress had pretty much been lied to about that. And that, of course, had led to this escalation and the deaths of thousands of American soldiers. And so this just, really called into question the honesty of the government and questions about transparency. Also just kind of showing that even when, not just the Gulf of Tonkin thing, But even when Johnson was saying publicly, we're not sending any, this is before the escalation, before Gulf of Tonkin, when he was saying publicly that we're not sending any of our boys to Vietnam, that they were really already kind of planning it, even when he was publicly saying that they weren't. That even when they escalated things, they never had a clear plan of how to get out. It just raised a lot of, well, it didn't raise questions, it just really exposed that there was a lot of misinformation, there was a lot of just downright lies, perhaps, that led to the United States getting involved in this conflict that seems to be tearing the country apart still. So this is incredibly damaging to the government. It creates this rather anti-government feeling, a sense of not trusting the government, which, already was quite problematic in the country. The government, obviously, and under Nixon, they tried to block this from being published. The Nixon administration tried to stop the New York Times from publishing it, said that it was important to national security or that it would damage national security to have these things published. Eventually, that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says, nope, you got to let them publish them. They said that you were unable to prove that this is damaging to national security and the public has a right to know. So the relationship between the press and the government is beginning to change here, with the press taking on more of a role of, exposing certain things, as they might put it, hold the powerful accountable for their actions. That the public has a right to know certain things, and there may be consequences for decisions that people that are in power will make. Now, this, I already mentioned that Nixon is quite the suspicious person. Already was. And when this happens, that just heightens his suspicions even more. Worried about, who leaked this, and, well, they know who leaked it, but, who else is leaking things, and we don't want anybody to leak stuff, and we need to keep all of our information within. So just keep that in mind, that Nixon's suspicion and his just obsession almost with keeping certain information within his administration and not letting things get out, that is going to influence his decision making and influence some of his behavior and cause him to do things or allow people close to him to do things that were either downright illegal or at least unethical, in order to prevent future leaks, in order to prevent negative stuff getting out about him, his administration, anything like that. He was very, very paranoid already. And something like the Pentagon Papers made him even more paranoid about leaks and information and who he could trust and all that sort of thing. Nixon was already a very mistrusting kind of a person. Now, I mentioned that one of the things that they're doing in Vietnam is trying to negotiate a peace agreement. That peace agreement is finally reached in 1973, and what is actually called the Paris Agreement. Like to name everything after Paris, don't we? Or do all these peace talks in Paris. The Paris Peace Agreement, the United States agreed to withdraw all troops from Vietnam within, I think, in like 60 days, 60 or 90 days, doesn't really matter. Withdraw all troops, and the 17th parallel would remain the dividing line. So very, very quickly, the United States will withdraw all of its forces according to this agreement, and the country will remain divided at the 17th parallel. Now, that is the end of the United States' active role in fighting Vietnam. Fighting will continue, just without the United States involved in it. That will continue on for a couple of more years, so it doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to stay divided, because it doesn't. So the United States gets out, and the fighting continues between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, the Viet Cong, and so forth for a few more years. That is until just about 2 years later, I think 1975, South Vietnam does fall to the communists. North Vietnam takes over all of Vietnam, and it is just Vietnam, and has been ever since then. So after many, many years of bloody fighting and 58,000 American lives and billions of dollars, in the end, exactly what the United States was trying to prevent ended up happening. Now, that didn't happen until after the United States was totally withdrawn, but it does result in Vietnam being unified under one government, communism, by 1975. This is a famous image of Saigon, which was the capital of South Vietnam, being frantically evacuated, hours before it fell. These were Americans still there, particularly like working in the embassy and things like that, or people that had families, frantically, you see them lining up to get into the helicopter to evacuate Saigon and therefore South Vietnam before it completely fell. But that is how that conflict eventually ends. Again, up until recently, the longest war the United States has ever been involved in. It's now been surpassed by Afghanistan, but at the time, and for a long time, the longest and certainly probably still the least successful American war. Now, with Vietnam, Nixon, of course, faces a great deal of criticism, and that contributes to a lot of unrest still at home. But I mentioned that in foreign policy, this is actually where we do see some of Nixon's greatest achievements. However, that's probably more in relationship to his handling of the Cold War. Nixon takes a much different approach to this than some of his predecessors have, and we see a completely new direction, and it completely transforms the relationship the United States has with certain major world powers, particularly with China. So it's, and this is someplace where Nixon kind of realized and where he kind of focused a lot of his attention, because he knew this was where he had the ability to probably make the most impact and to do the most things. Because domestically, as we're going to see on Monday, things are far more gridlocked. Because Nixon, remember, is a Republican. The Democrats still have hold of Congress, and so Nixon's not going to be near as successful with any kind of domestic policy because Congress is going to be blocking a lot of stuff that he might want to do. So he realizes that this is where he wants to, or decides this is where he wants to focus a lot of his attention, because he won't have to, Congress won't be stopping him and all of that. Okay, now an instrumental person in helping Nixon to shape and design and implement his foreign policy is his Secretary of State, and that's Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State under Nixon, therefore a huge part of Nixon's foreign policy that designs, and he helps Nixon implement a lot of this. He is one of Nixon's closest advisors. He also, like Nixon, can be quite paranoid and not very trustworthy. Maybe that's one of the reasons why they get along pretty well, but sometimes they didn't. They were kind of on and off as far as, a personal relationship, and both of them don't trust people well enough to really be, close friends with anybody. So when we think of Nixon's Cold War policy, Nixon, of course, has a lot to do with it, but so does Henry Kissinger. He's a big part of the Nixon administration. Now, the overall foreign policy that they implement in regard to the Cold War, in regard to the Soviet Union and communism in the world, is called détente. Okay, détente. And détente is a general word, but détente with a capital D like this. We're talking about Nixon's foreign policy. And détente means, that word, means a relaxing of tensions. A relaxing of tensions. We want to relax tension, cool things down a bit with the Soviet Union, with the communist world. We want to cooperate more, to say, what, it really doesn't make sense for us to all be at each other's throats all the time. Nobody wants nuclear annihilation. We don't want that. We have the whole mutually assured destruction thing, so that's not beneficial to anybody. But also saying there's a huge economic component to this. It's not doing any of us any good, economically speaking, to just constantly being butting heads about stuff. We need to be engaging with each other, and that can help transform everybody and make lives better for everybody. We're really missing out on a lot of opportunities by continuing to always argue about stuff. So we need to be more open, we need to be more transparent, and we need to ease those tensions, and then some of that other kind of easing of tensions will come with it. And this didn't just have to do with the Soviet Union, but also China, big part of Nixon's foreign policy, and where he takes a completely different direction than his predecessors is in regard to China. Because by this point, if you recall, China fell to communism back in 1949. Well, this is decades later, and by this time, China's become far more powerful. Their economy has grown significantly. They are quite a big rival for the Soviet Union, a big concern, actually, to the Soviet Union. And that's really what Nixon and Kissinger are trying to do, is play the China card, as they might say. And I'll get back to that in a second. Now, part of détente also includes something called what becomes called the Nixon Doctrine. We've had the whole Truman Doctrine and the Eisenhower Doctrine and all of that. This is kind of his version of containment. Their Truman Doctrine and Eisenhower Doctrine were all kind of their spin on containment, on what we want, where we want to do it, and why it's important and so forth. The Nixon Doctrine is a little bit different. It really alters the previously held views about containment or understanding of it or how it needed to be implemented. The Nixon Doctrine suggests, the United States cannot and will not try to contain communism everywhere. That it's not our job to police everybody. And that's not feasible. It's not going to, we don't have the ability, and it's not in our interest, it's not in anybody's interest, for us to run around, going around and fighting communism in every corner of the globe. So, we want to partner with communist governments when it's in our interest. We want to partner with communist governments when it's in our interest. So we only want to worry about those places where it's really of interest to the United States, where it's of relevance to the United States. They might argue that, for example, some little teeny tiny country in the third world that's dealing with a communist threat, that's not a big threat to the United States. We're not going to worry about that so much. But someplace like China, that's a massive country with a growing and massive economy, that's in our interest. And it's in our interest to engage with that country, not just fight with them. We can disagree, but think of all the business opportunities, think of all the trade opportunities that we can open up if we're not ignoring China and pretending like they don't exist, which is what the United States has been trying to do for the past couple of decades. So we're not going to, we're going to be selective in our commitments. We're going to be selective in where we want to focus our attention as far as containment. We're going to focus on the things that are really of relevance and of importance to us, and not just go around policing everything. So it's a much different version of the whole containment thing. Now, Nixon and with the whole detente, the biggest kind of, shockwave with all of this is the way that Nixon handles China, a completely different approach to China. Now, again, China had fallen to communism in 1949, not too long after World War II. And when that happened, if you remember, the United States did not get involved in it. But the United States refused to even acknowledge that there was a communist government of China. And that was still true by the time Nixon took office. The United States was still refusing to diplomatically recognize the communist government of China that had been in power at this point, for 30 years almost. And was still arguing or still taking the stance that the government that was in exile in Taiwan was still the official government. The United States, therefore, really had no official diplomatic relations with China. There were travel restrictions, trade restrictions, just completely and totally closed off. Nixon wants to change that. So first, Kissinger actually visits China, and then Nixon himself goes to China to visit on an official state visit. And again, that was completely shocking to a lot of folks, because again, the United States has been had this sort of, not literally, but figurative attitude the past couple of years, as if the, communist government of China didn't exist and it wasn't legitimate. We don't have anything to do with that. So for Nixon, you actually go there, meet with them, have nice fancy dinners, shaking hands, having, negotiations, telling jokes, enjoying each other, establishing that relationship. That was a really, really big deal. And also for it to be somebody like Nixon. What did we say earlier? Nixon kind of built his political career on in his younger years. Anti-communism, so for him to reach out to the communists in China, again, very, very significant sort of thing. So he actually refers, and it sounds like it shouldn't be that big of a deal, but it was. He actually calls China by their name, calling them the People's Republic of China. That's their communist name, which the United States had refused to use that word because that was the official name of their communist government. He refers to them that publicly on television. Goes to visit. All bunches of travel restrictions are eventually going to be lifted. Trade restrictions are going to be lifted. And that those markets could all open up, and American businesses were more than happy to, extend that business relationship with a very strong economy. And this dramatically changed, and many would argue improved, the relationship between the United States and China, and it will eventually result within a few years of the full diplomatic relationship being restored. The United States had pretty much cut off that diplomatic relationship after the communist takeover in 1949, but that will be restored within a couple of years of Nixon doing all of this. Now, again, part of the reason for this, the motivation for it, was this will help out the United States. We have an economic interest in engaging with an up-and-coming power like China. And it also has to do with the Soviet Union, because China was becoming such a, hold on just a second, okay, was becoming so powerful, that was becoming a threat to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was starting to see China not as, their little buddy that they were kind of raising up to be just like them. They are a rival now. The United States knows that very, very well. This is really quite genius. In warming up to China, what does that do to the Soviet Union? Yeah. That kind of forces the Soviet Union into an interesting situation. If the United States is going to warm up to their enemy, it's like kind of both the United States and China kind of almost ganging up on the Soviet Union together. So the United States, when we talk about playing the China card, it's let's use China to our advantage. That'll get us more what we want with the Soviets, because if we get China on our side, now we're a double threat kind of a thing. The United States also has intelligence through espionage, that the relationship between the Soviet Union and China is not so great, that there is a lot of tension there. And so a lot of Détente is trying to exploit that, really kind of a, little chess strategy there. So similar things, I didn't put it up there so much, but similar things are happening with the Soviet Union. Nixon also goes to the Soviet Union, goes to Moscow, meets with the Soviet premier. Brezhnev is in power by then. Same kind of thing, nice fancy dinners and meetings and shaking hands and, kind of building these personal relationships. And once again, trying to see this relaxing of tension, trying to extend the hand of, not we're going to be best buddies and allies, but we want to try to be more transparent and work together. And more restrained kind of a competition. Let's kind of pull it back a little bit. One result of that is something called SALT I. SALT, you don't need to be able to spell it out, but it stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, has to do with nuclear weapons. Okay, this is about negotiating about nuclear weapons and trying to hold back, pull back, reduce nuclear weapons. And there's more than one. That's the name. It's SALT I. Later you'll see SALT II. But these are agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union, limiting like the number of nuclear warheads you could have, and trying to just kind of showing this commitment at the time to try to stop the nuclear arms race, to sort of relax these tensions. This is one of the results of Détente, is these agreements and these negotiations to try to limit nuclear weapons and, kind of pull everybody back from this arms race. So it does ease some concerns, and it does open up a lot of economic opportunities, particularly in relation to China. So Détente, people saw it and do see it very, very differently. But easy to see or argue that this is one of the things that where Nixon does at least get lots of results is with Détente. And then when we get to Reagan, we'll see the whole thing just reversed the other way. So fun times. So we'll see on Monday with domestic policy, Nixon is far less successful. And there's a lot of kind of weird things going on economically with the economy, with inflation and such. We'll see how Nixon tries to handle some of that, as well as also looking at some of the continuing movements for women's rights and the environment and things like that throughout the 1970s as well. All right, so questions on anything there about Détente?